thank you so much. I want to say thank you to the Embassy of Germany, to the BMW Center, to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Foundation, and to Georgetown for hosting this event and getting such a serious group of people together for a conversation on an important holiday that happens to fall on Saturday. The questions have been amazing so far. We are mindful of the fact that it's 2 p.m. in the afternoon. So we're going to be switching to audience questions about halfway through to make sure everyone stays on their toes and to hear from you, because there are a lot of people in this audience, some of whom who've been there and have opinions on what has happened since 1989. So I will do a brief intro. We have Ambassador Ivan Korčok, representing the Slovak Republic to the U.S. on the far end. Next to him, we have Georgetown professor, Dr. Angela Stent. She directs the university's Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, and she's also a former member of the National Intelligence Council focused on this part of the world. Then we have Alina Polyakova from the Brookings Institution, and she has written a book called The Dark Side of European Integration that focused on the rise of far-right political parties in Europe, as well as doing a bunch of recent research on this subject that tried to focus on, okay, we know what the problem is, now what do we do? So we'll be digging into some of that in our discussion. And then we have Jill Dougherty, a colleague from CNN, who is the Centennial Fellow at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. And that means you are both a mentor to students, and she's going to be having a course coming up in the spring that I want to sign up for, which is to teach working journalists about understanding Russia, since we talk about it and cover it almost daily with this U.S. administration. I want to start off with a sort of lightning round of how you would address the theme of this panel: liberal political visions and narratives against nationalism, rising from 1989. Ambassador, can we start with you?
Thank you very much. I first would like to thank Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and Georgetown University for having us all here. And when I looked at the speakers of this conference, I realized that maybe it is only President Kwasniewski and me who are representing countries who lived on the wrong side of Berlin Wall. And I feel really privileged to be here today and speak about the most important moment in my life. I can say so. And before I get to your question, I can say that for me, it is a miracle, that happened exactly 30 years ago. Realizing that each and every time when I come across somehow in my mind or physically with the wall, can I share one short story with you about the wall? It happened to me here in the United States. It was in March this year, and I remember that day very much because it was amidst March Madness when we went to Virginia University, 4 ambassadors from Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia. We were welcomed by the dean of that university, and he was leading us to the hall where we were supposed to have a discussion like this one. And he told us, but on the way there, we have a Berlin Wall on the grounds, because at Virginia University, I've learned a new word. It's not the campus, it's the grounds. And they have a piece of Berlin Wall there, which was donated to remind students of this ugly wall. And then the story is that students accompanying us, they told us, why don't we have a picture here in front of the wall? And they told us, be here. And I told them, no, but not on this colorful side with graffiti, because we lived on the opposite side of it. And I will never never forget that moment when I realized how difficult it was for us to explain to them that it was not the colorful side of the wall, but it was the gray and cold side of the wall where millions of people, including me, were living. So this is indeed something that I still call a miracle for me, certainly because then, fast forward a few years later after Berlin Wall fell, I could walk through the Brandenburg Gate after I presented my credentials to the German president, the Slovak ambassador. But I'm mentioning this because when you read articles these days about where we are 30 years on, one can see a mixed picture, a gloomy picture, and that very much is linked to your question. Many people are disappointed. They expected more, and the question is why. But with all that gloomy mood, I think it has to be recognized that major progress has been achieved since. We, including my country, we became part of community of Western democracies. And, you know, why there are such tendencies and phenomena like populism and extremism all of a sudden, one has to see that from that moment on when we regained freedom, we became part of the West. And what's going on now in Central Europe cannot be, in my view, seen in an isolated way from what's going on in the West at large. But I think the best way how to deal with populism is how it was described this morning by President Kwasniewski and Chuck Hagel. I think Democrats have much more to offer to people. Populists have to be measured, you know, their words have to be measured with deeds. And one has to see that with all the problems that we are experiencing right now, we are much, much better off than we were before 1989. But our societies are not immune to those phenomena. And Chuck Hagel said that it's not Central Europe only, it's the Western democracies that are undergoing right now a period of volatility. But that has many, many causes and reasons which are behind it, but we can get back to it.
Absolutely. Dr. Stent.
Okay. Well, since it is November the 9th, I think I will also start off with my story. Where was I on November 9th, 1989? I was teaching a class in comparative politics to Georgetown undergraduates, and I got back to my office, and there was a phone message, and it was from the local NBC affiliate. Would I please come on and talk about the fall of the Berlin Wall? So I called them back, and my first instinct was to say, "What have you been smoking?"
So this was before Twitter, right?
Right, there's no Twitter. Anyway, I immediately adapted and said, "Well, of course, we always knew this was going to happen." No, but it was an amazing, it was an amazing day, and I think it was hard to comprehend, what was happening then. So I'm going to answer this question about what can we do about what we see, the disappointed expectations, the rise of populism. I think we have to remember we academics, I think, made a big mistake after 1989 and then subsequently after the fall of the Soviet Union in thinking that there was going to be a sort of linear transition. You're going to start at one point and then you're going to end up somewhere else, and that other point is democracy, it's markets, it's the rule of law, and it's kind of dealing with your history. It's obviously much more complicated than that. I mean, you can look at this country and how long it has taken this country to come to terms with some of the darkest parts of its history going back a couple of hundred years. So it's not surprising that in 30 years, things haven't gone in a linear way. And so I think, we're still trying to cope with that. But I think the other lesson, and particularly when you look at Central and Eastern Europe, and obviously Russia itself and the post-Soviet states, it's the importance of confronting not only the history of what happened during the communist period, and we've heard about in the previous panel about lustrations, about and about how different countries have tried to deal with it. But unfortunately, it also is going back to what happened in the 20s and 30s, because a lot of the roots of what you see maybe in a country like Hungary and parts of what's happening in Poland today and in other parts, at least in Central Europe, never mind the post-Soviet states, are issues that were there in the interwar years that were never really dealt with. And I think without a fuller understanding of history and an ability to deal with it, it becomes much more difficult to cope with what we see today. You know, where do these ideas come from? And then I think the final point I will say is on Russia, and I've been very aware of that with just having commemorated the outbreak of World War II in September, where the Russian Foreign Ministry has basically become the Ministry of Historical Revisionism. I mean, they have put out their version of what happened, the outbreak of the war in 1939, and what they did. So, you know, the version on their website is the Soviet Union did not invade Eastern Poland on the 17th of September. It, quote unquote, Soviet forces went into territories that used to be part of Ukraine and that Poland then took from them, and Belarus took from them. So I'm just saying historical revisionism is alive and well in many places, and some of the narratives we see in both Western and Central and Eastern Europe are also reinforced by some of the things that are coming out of Russia. So this is an issue of dealing with what's happening domestically, of confronting the past, but also making sure, and I'm sure Alina will talk about that now, about the way that this is aided and abetted by outside forces.
Thank you. Dr. Polyakova.
So thank you. I don't have as much of an exciting story about where I was in 1989, but I was on the other side of that gray wall. Farther east, the newer ambassador, I was in the Soviet Union, Ukraine. And I was still relatively a young child then, but we immigrated to the United States a few years after the fall of the wall. But I will say that my memories of that time period are of, you know, my family, you know, the adults in the room, not foreseeing that the Soviet Union would fall after 1989. I think now we tend to see, so 89 is the beginning of the end. We mark that as the end of the Iron Curtain, as the end of the Soviet regime. But in fact, inside the Soviet Union, it was still, to most people, I think, unimaginable that in just a few years, countries like Ukraine and others would become independent and sovereign states. And so at the time when we left in 91, we were still Soviet citizens in Ukraine, at least for a few more months. We had to give up our passports to come to the United States as political refugees. But it never crossed my parents' mind they would be able to come back, because they thought we were leaving forever, and we were treated as if we were leaving forever at the border. And so I think it's important to remember that in hindsight, we kind of see this as one lump, you know, 89, 91, 93, 94, the transformation, as we call it, from socialism. But there were a series of decisions and events that led us to this outcome that was not at all inevitable, actually. And I think I'm keen to hear more from you, Angela. You've written so much about this, and you as well, Jill, on some of those key decision points, because I think in hindsight, we think it was an inevitable linear line, as you said, Angela, that we're going to get this third wave of democratization, which happened in the early 1990s with the fall of the Soviet Union. But in fact, what we're seeing now is these ebbs and flows in the path of democracy. And I think in Central Eastern Europe specifically, and also in some of the former Soviet states, we've seen many revolutions. In some places like Ukraine, where I'm from, we've seen 2 revolutions now. And it's still unclear where that country will land in the longer term, in the 20, 30, 40-year term. And part of that story, of course, is what's been happening in the West, and how our, I think, lack of vision for a post-Cold War order in many ways has allowed openings for a country like Russia, who does have this revisionist mentality or vision of the world, and increasingly countries like China, to be able to exploit vulnerabilities in these fledgling democracies, but also in what we call consolidated democracies in the United States and Western European countries. And what we see now is this sort of, I think, a backlash emerge in Europe, which is, thanks for mentioning my book, which was the result of my doctoral work back in the day. Basically, what we see now is this backlash against this very, very rapid euphoria that led to Euro-Atlantic integration in these countries. And some of those dreams, I think, were not fulfilled for a sector of the population that has led, to a certain extent, to the emergence of these right-wing populist movements, also in some places left-wing populist movements across Europe, including in the West and Central Eastern Europe. But I think there's positive bright lights here that we can talk about later, that's also not a linear line. So just because we have this wave of populism, I guess I say sweeping across Europe and the United States, it doesn't mean this is the inevitable trajectory going forward either. And so I think in the whole, it's important to relive those moments from 1989 because there's so many lessons we can still learn today. And those lessons come from those specific decision points that were made by political leaders, civil society groups, and individuals who went to the streets, who protested, who fought for independence. And I think we're in a moment now where we need to recapture that spirit of fighting back against some of the illiberal trends we're seeing, specifically in Central Eastern Europe.
Thank you. Professor Dougherty.
Okay. Well, not yet.
I'll call. Okay, well, you're
Close
here
enough.
right now.
Close
Fellow
enough.
Dougherty?
You know, it's funny, as I was listening to these really wonderful comments, and I was thinking, where do I fit into this discussion? Because I'm not part of 1989. I'm more part of 1991, because my field is Russia. And so I guess along with a lot of other people, in 1989, looked on, in amazement. But it didn't, I guess I didn't really realize what it meant to me. 91 happened, and I'll give just my personal remembrance of that, because it's all part of this process, of course. I had started working at the White House for CNN. I'd studied Russian since I was 14 years old in high school. It was something that I was completely mesmerized, interested, addicted to. And I found myself on December 25th, 1991, on the front lawn of the White House because I had to work Christmas, because I was the new person at the White House. And all of a sudden, as you remember, the flag comes down in the Kremlin, the Soviet Union is over, and I stood there, honest to goodness, just in shock that this country that I had been so interested in. Personally, I'd been an exchange student in Leningrad. I had Russian friends. I was totally interested in this country. And all of a sudden, it was over. And it was the same thing. Well, of course, we knew that was going to happen. Of course, we didn't know it was going to happen. And I would like to postulate that it ain't over. I think that the collapse, the end, the wall falling, and the end of the Soviet Union continue to live on, that the Soviet Union and some of that thinking and mentality lives on in people's minds. And the more I'm in this field, the more I would like to, maybe because I'm not an academic, so I can allow myself to be more emotional, I think that the emotional part of this is very, very important. How people feel about themselves. At that period, we had two ideologies, communism, Marxism, Leninism, capitalism. And then all of a sudden, those ideologies were up for grabs because Marxism, Leninism had lost, supposedly, and capitalism had won. Also, you had the military dimension, and you could say that the West had won militarily. That's a big debate. But I think in the minds of people and in the hearts of people, it wasn't that easy. There was really no winning or losing. And it was not ideological. I really think that if you asked a person, which I've done in many countries of the former Soviet Union, what did it mean to you that your country ended? And they did not talk about Jeffersonian democracy. They did not talk about ideas. They didn't talk about liberal values. They talked about, my child can no longer go to the Crimea on vacation. I lost my job in the factory. Oh my goodness, the shoes that we used to get at the store coming in from Germany are no longer there. How am I going to live? In other words, their daily life and the economic component of their lives became very important. The structures that they had lived under, the vacations that they had, the food that they had, the social structures were all gone. And I really believe that we cannot exaggerate how disorienting that is and continues to be for people in that area. Because as Angela said, there was this idea that it would be a seamless transition to the new thing. I was a journalist. I've been a journalist for too long, 40 years. And I remember people saying, well, it's over. They'll be just like us, going to turn into the West, and they will understand, of course, Western values are superior. And why study Russian anymore? Why even pay attention to Russia? It's all going to be boring. And of course, it was как раз наоборот, completely opposite. And so when I look at this, I think there's another factor at play, which is, broadly speaking, this collapse of the old system and transition to the new begins at the very moment when society is being transformed with new things like the computer, the internet, and now social media. So at that very moment that if we had not had those factors, change might have been a lot slower, or I don't even know how it would end, but we had that transition, which also includes a transition in labor and the way people do make their money. And think of the towns in, not only in the Soviet Union, but in Eastern Europe, that were mono-economic towns built on one industry that suddenly died. So you had a change in the structure of work and life that was affecting not only the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, but it's affecting us. And it's affecting Europe, and it's affecting Asia and the entire world. So I think historically, when I look back, I would think, isn't it interesting that the computer world was just kind of getting off the ground at that particular time? Now, what we do about all of this, I can't even say, but I do believe that if there's a task for Western democracies, and there's a task for people living in those countries who have to make their own decisions, especially I think about Russia. They have to make a lot of their own decisions now, that we have to look at equality. And equality, I was reading that article about East Germany and West Germany, and the fact that, I think it was in the Times today, or maybe the Post, where they were talking about people who lived in East Germany feeling unequal to people in the West. And literally they are, because economically it's much better than it used to be, but there is a difference between how people live in the East and in the West, and now it's all one. But they don't feel that way. They feel, and it reminds me of some of the thoughts in Russia, which is they feel unequal, and they feel that other people are rubbing their noses in that and looking down upon them because they are somehow inferior or damaged or from that whatever it was world. And that's really difficult. How do you make people feel that they're equal? So I think the best way is you give them a job and you give them opportunity. And I would argue that that is the one major way that we in the West who do enjoy democracy could help, not only help people in that region, but help ourselves, because we have sometimes the same divisions in parts of the United States. I often, I go to Moscow a lot. I saw a friend just a few weeks ago, and we were both saying that this is crazy to say, but she and I have more in common in our education, our outlook on life, our exposure, and our two things, and our dreams about where we're going than I have with some of my fellow Americans, which is a very kind of sad thing to say, but it's true. So if we can, I think, create opportunities for true equality, that might be the best of all. Thanks.
So to reflect back to you what I'm hearing from you all, some themes that I'm picking up. First of all, it's not over. That you keep saying, you know, it's not a linear evolution. There was both a failure of imagination and hubris on the part of the West about thinking, okay, we've vanquished a system we didn't like, but is it now our responsibility to make sure that that system the people who were under that system don't completely fall over? And then the third thing is, that I think I'm hearing from all of you, is democracy hasn't quite measured up to its promise. So I'd like to start with the ambassador, because you had, your country had the Velvet Revolution. Your country engineered sort of peaceful change that brings in democracy. Arguably, it's not doing so well with it right now. How did you implement it then, and what are some of the pitfalls right now?
I think one of the problems that we are facing, not only in Slovakia, but I think in Central European or post-communist countries, whatever, is that we are sort of losing battle over democratic narrative. I don't know whether this is correct in English, but what I mean by that is that the core of liberal democracy, in my view, is rule of law. But when you communicate to ordinary citizens in east of Slovakia or in Germany or in Hungary and elsewhere, rule of law, rule of law, rule of law, they don't know what's the point there. And I think we have to be more precise in explaining to people that without rule of law, there cannot be prosperity. Without independent judiciary, there will not be new investments, because for any foreign investor, one of the criterion, whether they allocate their money in Slovakia or not, is independent judiciary. And you can continue with other principles which should be enshrined in a practical life, political life in our countries. Then I think people could better understand what is at stake when some, all of a sudden, 30 years later, are not talking anymore about liberal democracy, but rather illiberal democracy and other alternative type of governance. So I think this is key, that we really communicate more clearly to our people what is at stake when it comes to rule of law, because this issue is coming up in Central European countries that cannot be ignored.
So my counterpoint would be, well, isn't rule of law something you should be able to tangibly experience in a positive way in your life? So you shouldn't have to be teaching people about it. They should be able to see it in action.
Not teaching, but all of a sudden people are confronted with the criticism coming from European institutions vis-a-vis our neighbors in Poland and in Hungary, but ordinary people don't know. Why are they criticizing us? We are a sovereign country, so why there is a criticism of our judiciary?
So how would you...
This is very artificial, I would say. But if people don't understand that without independent judiciary, without free media, there cannot be prosperity. And I think we've seen that when...
So if I heard you say just the line you just said, that without free media and without rule of law, there can't be prosperity.
Yeah.
It sounds like buzzwords. How would you explain it to someone in a rural location who's grown up in a farming community and thinks Brussels is full of a bunch of overpriced, highly paid bureaucrats?
Of course, this is difficult, and populists are much better, and that's why there is this surge of populism, because it's much easier for any populist to criticize European Union for all the mistakes and all the faults that we are experiencing right now. But this is, I've been experiencing those debates in Slovakia, and it can work. When you speak to younger generation, I think you can address them when stressing once again that the best type of governance, that we should uphold and fight for is liberal democracy, which was the outcome of 1989. And without that, I think we cannot make our economy sustainable. Because
but again, when I know what you mean when you talk about making the economy sustainable, but I'm being an obnoxious journalist asking you to Dick and
Kimberly,
Jane
if I knew, I would not be here. I would be somewhere in the rallies in Slovakia in an election campaign. That's why I'm diplomat. So I'm not giving an advice. I'm not a political advisor to any politician. But that's what I believe, what we have not, unfortunately, seen recently in our countries. Because once again, you have to see that I think in recent years, for example, we have not seen the stupid form of nationalism, so nation against nation, but rather we have seen people mobilize against institutions. And and this criticism towards Poland and Hungary, it is coming from European institutions which are trying to uphold the very principles we have committed to when we became members of the European Union.
And even as I'm giving you a hard time saying, how would you simplify it? I know that populist politicians, they don't necessarily have to tell the truth. You, as a member of your government and the EU, you can't go out and tell a group of people something that's very simple but might not quite be right.
I mean, not necessarily all of them will understand, but I'm certain when I come to central Slovakia and tell to people that investor from Germany will only invest in your city or in your village if we in a country can provide for independent judiciary, because for them it is important, and that's why
so that they can take if they have a trade dispute, they can take it to a judiciary system they trust.
That's what I mean.
You just explained it. Okay.
Yeah? I'll try.
Dr. Stent and Polyakova, you've both been like sitting there.
So I want to mention an important word which is tied to what you said, and that's corruption, right? So first of all, in the entire, behind the Iron Curtain, if we can still use that phrase, in the entire communist world, these were all very corrupt systems. The population understood it. They understood that the communist parties were incredibly corrupt. I mean, it was particularly true in the Soviet Union, but it was true everywhere else. And that's how the world functioned. Then suddenly, communism is overthrown, right? And you have new governments come in. And what the West is saying to Central and Eastern Europe and also to the former Soviet states, you know, if you want to become more democratic, if you want to have the rule of law, you have to deal with corruption. But what people experience is, those are very fine words, but still on their basic daily lives, there's still a lot of corruption there. It's never gone away. It's certainly true in Russia. It's true in many parts of Central and Eastern Europe. And, you know, it's also true in parts of the West, too, and in our very own country. So I think, and in some senses, and particularly if you're talking about dark money and organized crime and corruption, and then not to mention offshore accounts, you know, in Panama and everywhere else. I mean, the Western countries facilitate some of this corruption because they're making money out of it too. Just today there was another article about British-Russian relations, or there's a new inquiry that's just come out in London about this. And obviously there are a lot of people in England who are doing very well from Russian and other money, which is corrupt. So I'm just saying that unless we fundamentally can deal with this kind of issue, and where ordinary people believe that they have a fair share, it comes back to what you said about equality too, Jill. And that also means living in societies where you don't have to pay someone if you want to get your kid into a good college or something like that, and where there's more equal opportunity, and it's not just based on that. But I don't, you know, it's a huge amount to tackle, and there you have to have the West tackling this as much as the Eastern countries, and I really didn't want to even talk about this at this conference today. But if you have a president of the United States tell a Ukrainian president that if you want this from me, military assistance, you better tell your prosecutors and others to start an investigation into my political rival, he understands that perfectly, and that's clear from the transcripts too, because that's how they do business, and that's one of the reasons why I think that fuels some of the populism.
So, Dr. Polyakova, some of the recent Brookings reports have mentioned both Slovakia and the Czech Republic as areas where illiberalism is on the rise. So what have you seen there in your research, and how would you advise the ambassador to reach out to that countryman?
I promise I will comment on it.
Well, I just want to take a quick step back because I think we've been having this conversation. We're making I think pretty common assumptions around the link between economic growth or decline and the rise of disaffected voting for more anti-establishment, populist, far-right or far-left groups. But I actually see that the link doesn't exist in the evidence that we see at an aggregate level across Europe. So if we look at economic growth in all of Europe since 1991, it's been incredible. Obviously you have a dip after the 2008 financial and economic crisis, but look at Poland, for example, where you have some of the highest growth in Europe, and you also have the strongest, you say populist political party in power that just consolidated control in the recent election. So I think we have to understand the link between economic growth and liberal democracy is not actually real.
So are you saying that the values of the people in the country weren't being represented, and that's what led to a rise of illiberalism there, even though they had jobs, et cetera?
Well, I think it's a much more nuanced picture because we have to go look at a very local context. But what we see, again, at the broader level is there are some trends here. And one of the trends is that it's that perception matters more than the reality on the ground. Mm-hmm. So another example of this is another reason why we often say this is why we've had the rise of far-right populism in some European countries because of immigration, and specifically Muslim immigration that went along with the 2015 crisis. But actually the countries that tend to be most anti-immigrant, like Hungary, again, like Poland, have no Muslim immigrants. And so they refuse to accept them for the most part. And so again, I think this is just important. These are specific examples or case studies, but I think it's important to remember that what these parties are particularly good at is not delivering results. It's about, they've been very good at understanding how there's been a gap between so some people experience reality and their aspirations. So I think the expectations were so high since these countries joined the EU, especially in 2004, and then Bulgaria and Romania in 2007, that actually nothing could have really fulfilled them in a way. And on top of that, these cultural issues around identity, that is what is driving support for these kinds of anti-establishment, populist, right-wing political movements.
Because they felt their identities were being sort of washed out by globalism or EU or not recognized by the parties above.
Yes, any enemy. Sometimes it's the EU in some countries, sometimes it's globalism, sometimes it's the political establishment, right? Sometimes the United States. So there are many versions of this enemy you could choose, kind of the faceless bureaucrat that is screwing you over in some way. I think it's very easy for people to relate to that vision that it's us versus them. And that's what really defines kind of the populist term, much more than actual trends, real trends around economic growth or real trends around migration. But I think that perception is so key, especially in places, like I think was the important piece here, outside the urban centers. Because these are the areas that were underrepresented, and these are the areas where I think Orban, especially in Hungary, saw an opportunity to mobilize support and to kind of clench down on the entire country by gaining support outside the urban centers first.
So if I can just jump in with a question there, because that's similar to what happened in the United States, according to many of the obituaries of 2016, that people outside of urban centers felt underrepresented. Were they underrepresented? Was it their responsibility to step more into civic life? And this is just a response to, is this just a result of them engaging? And so we're now having to hear vigorously from a more conservative, and some would say racist or ethnocentric, or, insert description here. Is it because they're participating and they didn't before?
I think it's just a bit more complex than that. I think that obviously the economic prosperity on the whole has not been equally distributed. In the United States and also in European countries, as we've moved to post-industrial societies, clearly sectors of the population, manual labor, the working class had been losing out. And actually, if we look at who gave the initial boost to some of the far-right political movements in the 1990s in Europe, it was the working class to a huge extent that left the labor parties, that left the social democratic parties, and instead of moving to the center-right, they moved all the way to the right. Because these political parties were able to appeal to the sense of loss that some communities were experiencing, and that activated those communities and mobilized them. And I think in many ways what happened in the United States, like somebody who has studied Europe and does not study the United States as a profession, what happened in Central Eastern Europe to me almost looks like a little microcosm or prelude or preview to then what we see happening here.
So to ask you specifically, since Brookings and your research mentions Slovakia and the Czech Republic, what are some of the issues there?
Well, I will add a little bit of nuance to that, because in that report, which you mentioned called Democracy Playbook, which just came out, was a follow-up to a report we published about a year ago that looked at how illiberal leaders, or self-styled liberal leaders, actually start to push back against democratic institutions, whether it be the independence of the judiciary, whether it be independent media, whether it be consolidating economic control in the hands of a few of their cronies, which goes clearly to the corruption question that Angela mentioned. And Slovakia and the Czech Republic are places where we see some warning signs. It's definitely Hungary and then Poland that are the countries that have gone so far in the non-democratic direction in some ways. Whereas, I think Slovakia remains a bright light in many ways. And I'm not an expert in Slovakia at all, so I don't want to speak and let the ambassador cover that. But we see warning signs there as well, where you see...
So what are the warning signs? Yeah.
Well, on the one hand, it's interesting because you see the election of President Kaputova recently, who I think came out of the blue. She's obviously a well-respected lawyer by trade. Nobody saw her coming, not corrupt individual. We see in Bratislava and also in Prague, but also in some other capitals now, opposition forces being able to gain control in local politics. But I think there is sort of the same trends that we're seeing in Hungary and Poland, and a little bit in the Czech Republic, we're starting to see in Slovakia. And what I mean by that is just this rhetoric of populism. It's more, to me, it's more on the level of narrative that we're seeing emerge in the political discourse. And
so can you give me an example, or could you give us an example, since I don't follow a rhetoric, populist rhetoric?
No, I think this is the first turning point. I don't want to speak in this entire panel, but I think in the studies that we've done on these issues as the sequencing of how do you get, from Orban, who's in the 1990s is hailed as this liberal Democrat, to Orban now, who self-styles himself as an illiberal Democrat. And we were trying to understand what are the sequences of events. And the first thing you see is a very simple change in language, where you go from talking about kind of an inclusive view of liberal democracy, and you switch to this us and them rhetoric that is very anti-immigrant, that tends to be xenophobic, that's this fortress Europe. And these are the kinds of public discourse trends you're also starting to see in some of the debates, I would argue, in Slovakia and the Czech Republic and elsewhere, even though we're not seeing by far the same kinds of attacks on the judiciary or independent media in Slovakia, certainly as we're seeing in Hungary and Poland.
Ambassador, I understand the reason I was picking on you is because I have a rare opportunity of the subject of one of your reports being on the panel. So.
No, you're absolutely right. We have populists, we have extremists, we have fascists in the parliament. But recently, I think one or two things happened which would rather be an evidence of an opposite development. One of them you've mentioned. It is not all of a sudden that we have elected for the first time in our history a female president. It's not all of a sudden that she won with an absolutely democratic and liberal narrative. I don't think so, that in a direct vote for a president, popular vote, it can come all of a sudden. And number two, yet again, Slovakia has provided a clear evidence of a very strong civil society. It was last year, after this horrible murder of a journalist, when thousands of people went on the street. And it was the guarantee that this act, this criminal act, would not be swept under the carpet. So I think these are rather things which make me confident and hopeful that Slovakia will maintain its, let's say, not liberal course, the course of liberal democracy. And in addition, compared to other three countries in Central Europe, Visegrad countries, Slovakia is the most open towards European integration. We are the only country with euro, which of course the precondition for it is that we have no problem, no ideological problem with more integration within the European Union. So those are at least, in my view, three elements that can make Slovakia a little bit distinctive from the rest. But once again, I started with saying there are populists, there are extremists. We don't know what happens next year in our parliamentary elections. It's on a relatively tiny eyes, but recently we have had these three things which I think were noticed here.
Jill?
You know, I just wanted to say maybe we build this argument as we go along and the conversation continues, but I do think that there are some hopeful signs. And in the neighborhood that I look at, which is in Russia, as probably some of you know, there have been citizen protests that are springing up not because of big democratic ideas and concepts and everything, but because, give you a few examples, because of a dump, a very toxic dump that was built outside, or continued to be built outside of Moscow, and another one farther away from Moscow, and citizens got together and decided that it wasn't going to happen, that it was not right, that these dumps should be there, that they were affecting their children. They protested, and in some cases, they won. And so it's not, I think it is important to remember that it's only 1989, and it's only 1991, and that really is not that long ago in history, in European history. And these things take time. And I do think that maybe I'm completely naive, but I do think that these signs that are happening in Russia, and I'm presuming, like the election of the president, this is an amazing, when I read about her, I thought, wow, that is really something. And to see people taking, again, getting back to the real things, you're saying, how do you teach people or encourage them or convince them? If they see it next to them, if they see a dump next to them that has been removed, or like the church that was going to be built in a park where people really love this park. The Russian Orthodox Church came in, wanted to build a church, and people said, we have nothing against the church, but we don't want it in our park. We like our park. This is another sign of people just kind of getting together. To me, that is citizen democracy. Where it all goes, I don't know, but I don't think we can know. I still think it's early, but these are, I think, hopeful signs.
So before I turn to mix in audience questions, I had one more sort of grim question for the panel about the rise of xenophobia and what's driving it, with a nod to history that, in addition to being the anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, this is also the 81st anniversary today of Kristallnacht, when so many Jews were killed. What explains that? If it's not competition for jobs, as you were saying, if it's something else, if it's even happening in countries that don't suddenly have an exodus into their country of people from a culture they don't recognize, what's driving it?
I mean, some of it is real, right? And I think you have to go back. I mean, unfortunately, Chancellor Merkel made a very generous decision to admit all of those refugees from Syria and other countries too. And it's given rise, as we can see, in Germany, and particularly in Eastern Germany, to the AfD, to these xenophobic parties. And as was already mentioned, in fact, most of the refugees are not in Eastern Germany, they're in Western Germany, and yet this is where the xenophobia is. So I would come back to what I sort of said at the beginning. I mean, I think if you look at the German case, you have a group of people who have really never, because they lived in the GDR, they've never come to terms with what Germany did, if we're talking about Kristallnacht, in the Nazi period. And this is why you have a resurgence in Germany of anti-Semitism and of sort of pro-Nazi feelings. And, you know, I think one has to take that very seriously. And the German cases may be unique because of German history. But there, the irony is that the people who are actually living with the refugees in Germany and helping integrate them are far less xenophobic than the ones who aren't.
Well, I'm not in a position to say where it comes from. I'm not dealing with, you know, sociological surveys and all that. But I think it cannot be denied that it is there. One phenomenon is certainly the confrontation with migration, and it's certainly a paradox where, you know, countries, the most scared countries, if you want, are those who have not seen any migrant. And obviously this has been played by politicians and misused.
You mean
by
because
politicians.
they're looking at pictures of what's happening in other countries, and it's,
Exactly, yes,
it's like
yes.
the boogeyman under
yes,
the bed.
Exactly, and it was used by populists who said, well, look at those countries, and they've been building on that narrative and stressing what problems there were in those countries where they were not able to integrate those who came either in this wave of migration or many, many decades ago. That's number one. Number two, with xenophobia and racism and everything. It is there, but what matters at the end of the day is whether the institutions of states can address that issue. And I can give you one example in Slovakia. We have had one member of the extremist or fascist party, which is in the parliament. He attacked our one member of Roma population in Slovakia. There was a decision by a court.
You mean attacked him with rhetoric or physically?
Rhetoric,
Okay.
rhetorically. There was a decision, help me Martin and Zora, was a decision by court, and he lost the mandate, full stop. So that gives me a hope that...
Apologies, does that mean he lost his seat?
His seat.
Okay.
He lost his seat in the parliament. So it's not the situation like 5 or 10 years ago when, you know, it was more or less or somehow, you know, accepted either by the society or institutions have not acted. No, this time already we see that the institutions have dealt with that. So I think you cannot uproot all that, I think. But what matters then that the institutions of state can deal with that.
Something I'd like to bring up is that every couple of years the National Intelligence Council, which is the combined wisdom of all the intelligence agencies, comes up with a futures report. And each futures report for the past decade or so has indicated an overall prediction of climate change leading to resource fights, criminal activity, global instability, migration and refugee flows. And if Syria is one example of that, if part of what caused Syria was a drought that led to farmers' protests, et cetera, Europe isn't doing too well. If it's going to get worse, what's a good example of how to handle it?
Well, I think that takes us into a slightly different realm in a way, because just quickly, I will just say that we haven't touched on what Jill brought up at the very beginning of her comments on the difference between now and 1989 is, of course, the presence of the digital domain. And the reason, I think, one big reason we don't understand very well is how imagery kind of plays into building certain perceptions. Let's talk about the perceptions are much more important than the reality on the ground. And so now the far more extremist groups are much better at using social media to get their message out, to mobilize support. They're much more comfortable with sensationalist content, much more comfortable with disinformation campaigns, which they've learned from another place, farther east. And
which U.S. intelligence says mostly is Russia. I'll say it for you.
Right, but it's not just Russia that's using these techniques. Russia may have introduce the playbook, but that's being used by domestic actors as well. And so what you see in a lot of countries, we're talking about this conundrum of where you don't have a large Muslim presence or a large immigrant presence, but these are the places that tend to be most fearful. This comes out in opinion polls as well. And this is the place where you tend to have populist leaders who are very effective at mobilizing around these cultural issues of identity. A lot of it does have to do with what people are seeing in their digital experiences, right, and their social media accounts. And so a party like the AfD has a lot more followers on social media than the CDU, the Chancellor's Party, for example. And so they're able to portray themselves as representing a much broader view, a much more mainstream point than they actually do in reality. And I think that's something we still don't fully understand and we're really struggling with. But I think to go back to your other point about what is to be done, if these trends will go on and on, as many, many reports, including the Nick reports, anticipate, I think that actually has to do with a very different question about where Europe specifically sees itself in the world going forward. Because what I find really fascinating about how the entire refugee crisis has been discussed in Europe is been discussed sort of devoid of the source of that crisis. So it's as if refugees have just appeared in Europe without a discussion of why they were there, which of course has everything to do with a terrible war in Syria, and the fact that Europe has not been involved to secure and to shift the nature of that conflict. And now the United States has been disengaging from that conflict as well. And that, of course, will continue to affect what's happening in Europe. Yet I'm not seeing a lot of discussions about Europe having a foreign policy in which we see German troops, for example, taking over for American troops to secure, say, the Kurdish fighters fighting against ISIS in Syria. No one has actually proposed that as a real plan, right? And so as long as we have this vision of Fortress Europe, and then and everything is seen as external shocks, devoid from their origins, I think we're going to see more and more of these kinds of political movements being able to take advantage of these situations.
So that comes back to, as the ambassador was talking about, how you come up with some simple language to explain to people, this policy that we're suggesting to take care of this problem is an articulation of our values and won't mean less for you economically. I mean, that is essentially the message you somehow have to come up with. As I turn to the audience, I would like to take 2 questions at a time, and please introduce yourself, and if you're with a particular institution, that as well. I'll take these 2 questions first.
Thank you. Marta Rebetic, I'm with the Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you for the presentation. And it seems that the nationalism has been cast in mostly negative light, and I think it is because we look at this from the current perspective of right-wing nationalism and so on. But actually, we are talking about 1989. I think that nationalism has played a positive role. And I was going to ask you about this because I think that the revolutions of 1989 were not just led by the idea of this having freedom and liberal democracies, but also about identity nationalism, thinking about the downfall of the Soviet Union. It's not just the push for freedoms, it's also the nationalist push that eventually led to the downfall of the Soviet Union. I would like you to comment on that.
Okay, so a question about the positive points of nationalism. And ma'am, you had a question as well? If you could introduce yourself.
Thank you. Thanks for this interesting discussion. My name is Dee Young, but I think first I want to mention the liberalism or nationalism. This probably is more political issues, but I would be more likely to ask for well-being of the people in that specific country. You know what I mean? The people well-being of their satisfaction may be not inside the soundbite of issues. There are other issues in that particular area of country may be more willing to tell you whether they are satisfaction, or whether their well-being are getting better, or rather than say, I don't know why the judicial system is not working right. They think judicial system may be corrupt, corrupt than you think. So I would like you to address the issues whether the well-being of the people or whether their family value are maintained, they have more satisfaction of family life rather than their family are separated.
Thank you, appreciate that. So let's start with the question of nationalism. Were there positive aspects of nationalism that led to the fall of the Soviet Union and could be harnessed now?
I would just jump in briefly. This is not exactly my expertise, but it seems to me that there aren't a lot of positive things about nationalism in Russia or in the region. And I think one of the problems for Russia is it does not have, let's say, a we can all win. There's much more of a zero-sum game idea, at least my impression is, of nationalism. And I think it was exacerbated by Marxism-Leninism, spreading communism around the world, the eventual defeat of the capitalist world, et cetera. I would like to think that it's good for Russia to be more proud of Russia. And I see that among some of the young people. But in my experience, it quickly morphs into, because we will win, we are better, we are more moral, and a kind of, as I said, zero-sum game.
We in America never say that about ourselves.
Actually, no, I'm saying they are saying it. Russia actually does believe right now that it is far more moral than Europe and the United States. So I encourage pride in countries, and I think that is important. I think that Putin has taken that as an objective of his to create pride. That's wonderful. I was just in Moscow. I saw people walking around, young people with jackets, Россия. That's great. But I would like to think more of the European approach, which is we can all be proud of our countries together. I think with Russia, that often is not the corollary to nationalism.
Yes. So I would like to agree with you that if we're not talking about Russia, if we're talking about the non-Russian parts of the Soviet Union, obviously national pride and the desire for self-determination was a very important element in what led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. When Gorbachev was at the Library of Congress in, I think, 1993, and he was asked, what was your biggest mistake you made? And he said, I underestimated the nationalities question. So, if we're talking about certainly the Soviet Union, it was the desire of people, Ukrainians, Armenians, whatever, to express their own national feelings and have a right to self-determination. And you could say in a way the same is true of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. I mean, they were independent states, but they had the Soviet-type system imposed on them. And so part of the revolutions of 1989 was not only, getting rid of the communist parties as they then were, but again, asserting their right to self-determination away from the Soviet Union. I won't say anything about Yugoslavia. I know you know much more about that than I do, but I mean, there were similar things at work there. So I think it is an important corrective to say that in 1989, and in the case of the Soviet Union in 1991, the desire for national self-determination, when we use the word nationalism in the United States, it usually has negative connotations. But let's say national self-determination went hand in hand with the desire, to move away from the communist system.
Ambassador, then it was Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
And how much did nationalism help drive the Velvet Revolution?
Yeah. I want to apologize for looking into my mobile phone while you spoke, but that was not, I didn't want to be unpolite. But because on the way here, I received a tweet from the President of the United States. A quote. No, wait. Bringing the word nationalism back into the mainstream. Great job by Rich Lowry. He's referring to his book, whatever. And I will not comment on that. I'm just saying that, when speaking about nationalism, I mean, it's not only Central Europe. Yes, the the national issue and whether we were driven by national pride in 1989. Martin Butora is here, Slovak ambassador to the United States 15, 20 years ago here in the United States, but with Zora Butorova, they both are sociologists. They know the Slovak society better than anybody else. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in 1989, where you were there on a stage, and basically those people were those who were running the revolution in Czechoslovakia. I, as a student, was there jangling keys and making it clear to communists that the time was over. But I didn't go on the square out of national pride. Not at all. We were driven by a dream of freedom and democracy, and we wanted to let communism collapse. But with my wife there, we were there for 10 or 11 days when there were demonstrations. It was not sort of against any other nation or to make Slovakia, a nation back then in 1999. But then with freedom, of course the issue of the national issues has emerged between Czechs and Slovaks. And for other and much more complex reasons, the former Czechoslovakia fell apart. Now, the issue of nationalism, in my view, as we see it right now in Central Europe, is not anymore, and I have referred to it 15 minutes ago, the nation against nation anymore, but rather a resistance and opposition against institutions. And we see it mainly as for those countries positioning themselves against European integration, against European Commission, against these institutions. And I see it being triggered, or as a pushback, being triggered by those in Europe who believed that we have embarked upon a path of creating sort of federal Europe and whatever. And that backlash comes from there. But once again, in 1989, in November, in that Velvet Revolution, Zora and Martin, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think it was like a national motivation behind our resolve.
Could we bring a microphone to the front so everyone can hear? And can you reintroduce yourself?
Yeah.
Yes, Martin Butora from Slovakia Institute for Public Affairs and previously civic activist and diplomat. Well, I think Ivan Korčok is right, but at the same time, it was, I would say, a national uprising against those who came to power because of sitting on Russian tanks. So it means it was not expressed in this way, but it was clear revolution and revolt against people who created one of the worst regimes after the Soviet occupation. So it was, from this point of view, the concept of national pride, let it be in Prague or in Bratislava, was embodied in sometimes what was anti-Soviet, what was anti the remembrance of the Soviet occupation. And if I may, just two brief comments. I think you talked about Slovakia. What has helped this country is that we had some previous experiences, and especially in the fight with Mečiar and Mečiarism. So, Ferit Zakaria wrote his famous article, Rise of Illiberal Democracy, 1997, when he mentioned Slovakia twice. But on the next year, we had elections with 84% of turnout, with involvement of civil society, with cooperation of various opposition forces, and Mečiar was lost. And it was also that Slovakia has experienced several arenas where we could fight for that concept of, let's say, liberal values. Yes, we had Tiso and fascist state, but then we had Slovak uprising. We had Mečiar, he had 80% of popularity, then he lost. We had this fascist Kotleba who won the regional election, but after 4 years he was defeated. So, and it was also thanks to civil society, which is quite, I think, strong and influential. And the last comment, if I may, is that we were talking about language. I think it was rightly mentioned here that the narrative of just the liberal values and liberal constitutionalism is not enough. But in Slovakia, now everyone understands what is it, rule of law, because we saw a horrible attempt at simply stealing the state by structures of mafia and structures of simply people who were trying to influence the development here. So now it's not a concept of rule of law. They saw corruption, they saw involvement of those forces in the political issues, and it helps to somehow proceed not only with the language of liberalism, but also with the language which I would call dignity. And language of dignity, it embraces several elements. One is freedom, beyond doubt. The other is rule of law, but it is also about simply the material situation of people who are living in a situation that they are not hurt, they are abandoned, they were not reached out, and who simply want also to participate in all of that.
So one of the things that I'm hearing from this discussion is that one of the things driving illiberalism is a dissatisfaction with what democracy has brought, the institutions of democracy. And it's part of Lillian's question as well, what are people complaining about? So in preparation for this panel, I was looking at various different polls, and I came up with one from the Open Society Foundations in YouGov. And of course, this is Open Society Foundations was founded by George Soros, who's become a big
Spectre.
Target.
yes, specter, a target, et cetera. But I saw this as a kind of an attempt to say, okay, what do the people think we're doing wrong? And among its findings, 6 out of 7 countries polled think democracy is under threat. The world is a more dangerous place in 1989, according to most of the respondents. And freedom to speak freely is under attack in 6 of the 7 polled countries, which included Slovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania. The majority view is that freedom of speech is under siege. So some of those countries are places where liberalism is on the rise, and some of those countries are places where people just seem to be dissatisfied with the system. So we come back to, I know it's subtle, but is there one thing stringing them together that, are these EU institutions that they feel are overwhelming them, not serving their needs, and is it good to listen to that? Number of questions in there.
I just want to chime in a little bit on this conversation because I think we're still lumping liberal democracy as a single concept, and I think we need to disintegrate those because I would put out there, and I think this is actually reflected in deeper surveys, population surveys, that people are actually not so dissatisfied with democracy. They're satisfied with what they see as liberal values. They don't think represents perhaps their own value systems, right? They feel like these cultural, I guess it goes back to culture, and these cultural values are being imposed on them. And this is something you see very, very clearly in some of the Russian narratives around the West, that the West is in this cultural decline and degradation, that we don't have that we don't have traditional family systems, that it's just like secularism and debauchery. Right? This is the Russian push narrative that, of course, is also picked out by these populist forces as well. And so we have to remember is that in all of these countries, these individuals that we're talking about, whether it be Orban or whether it be the Peace Party in Poland, come to power through democratic elections that are free and fair. But once they're there, they start to use the bureaucratic administrative levers to try to undermine democratic institutions from within. And so if you dig deeper in some of these surveys, and I haven't seen the one you mentioned, but like the Pew surveys, for example, if you ask people what they think about democracy, you see dissatisfaction. But then if you ask people what they think about the values we associate with democracy, like your ability to say what you want, your ability to have objective independent media, however that's usually phrased, things of that nature, actually there's huge support for democracy, values, right? But I think it goes back to our early conversation, the ambassador pointed to, how do you get people to kind of take out what is a black box, which is democracy, and understand what are the actual values that do affect you in day-to-day life. And so there's all these scary surveys where people have written books about this at this point, where you have millennials and even younger people increasingly saying they don't see why democracy is valuable, they would be okay under military rule, right? It's not majorities, but it's going up, up, and up in Western European countries and in the United States to a certain extent. But I think once you dig deeper, you actually see that what people want is freedom, right? And that value of freedom and liberty is what's actually encapsulated in what we call democracy. But when you see surveys like this, it doesn't actually come out that way.
I want to take two more questions, sir, and then one in the front row. Why don't we take three? I'll also take the gentleman over there.
Thank you. Dieter Detke, Georgetown University.
Oh, can you hold the microphone a little bit earlier?
Sure.
Thank you.
Dieter Detke, Georgetown University. I have a specific question for Professor Stent, and I also want to ask this panel, wonderful panel of Russian experts. The question is, you recently went to the Valdai conference, and you came back with a very specific message from Putin, saying that the West is in decline, Russia, China, India are rising. And my question now is, I assume you're just the messenger and not necessarily identifying with the message. But here's the point. Do you think he has a point, or is he just referring to his own threat, domestic threat in Russia, and trying to say, we better be careful with our own opposition here in Russia? So please explain that a little bit, the message that you came back with. Thank you.
All right, for our first question, and then the gentleman over here in the glasses, if you could introduce yourself and ask your question.
I'm the first-year student from Alice School of International Affairs. And my question is that you talk about value and national value and culture different from state by state. So I'm wondering that in the first half of the 20th century, political scientists Elmont have developed a theory of the political culture, which categorized three different kind of political culture, including the subjective political culture and the participant political culture. Do you think those kind of the different unique national value or culture, which may cause the negative impact on the liberal democracy, is a kind of result from those subjectiveness or participation?
Let me mirror that back to you to make sure I understood it right. You're essentially asking, is there a difference in national values or culture that would cause a rejection of democracy? Or am I saying that right?
Rejection to the liberal democracy specifically, yeah.
Okay, and one more question in the front row.
My name is Zora Butorova. I'm a sociologist, and it will not be a question, it's more a comment, if I may.
Okay.
It's a comment on how to assess whether a country goes in the direction of illiberalism or no, and I think it's really not enough to focus only on public opinion polls and surveys, although I'm doing them, so I know very well. But it's important also to disaggregate the society and to see how strong are various groups and streams within the society, and how strong they are not only in proclaiming some values in surveys, but in action. And from this point of view, it's important to see whether the society is able somehow to cope with some dangerous tendencies, in how far civil society is able to express something. And from this point of view, as for Slovakia, I would say that yes, we are threatened, similarly to other countries, by illiberalism. But on the other hand, we are one of those countries where we see that that many people who realize that there is this threat are trying to oppose it, and until now, in the last 2 years, we're quite successful in this. So obviously we are facing elections, and there we will see the strength in how far all these appeals on conservative values like, I don't know, the threat of the traditional family and so on, in how far they are really appealing to people. Because I know I could give examples of other surveys from which it is clear that those things are not so important, that there are things which are much, much important.
So I think what you're saying is, so rather than being, a typical media type and exaggerating this threat because of the number of tweets or something that I see, let's see how much political power they gain on the ground,
yes,
and if that's a real threat to institutions?
Yes, and then there is one important element in all our countries around that. Obviously, Slovaks are very Euro-optimistic. And in all surveys, our people trust much more European institutions than they trust our own parliament, our own government, and so on. And it's not just in Slovakia. It's, for instance, Hungary, which is really has some, I would say, symptoms which can make us fearful about their future, but they trust more European institutions. So the picture is much more complicated, than to rely just on surveys is not
Thank you
enough.
very much. So of the couple of questions, let's start with the Putin question. And I also have to point out that, Dr. Stent, you came out with a book on Putin this year, which was entitled Putin's World, Russia Against the West with the Rest. So to that question of Putin saying the West is in decline and they're morally superior, how much of that is for internal consumption and how much of it does the Russian leader in the Russian world truly believe?
So, Dieter, as you know, I'm the messenger when I talk about this, right? I didn't say these words. Look, if you are sitting in Moscow, not only in Moscow, if you objectively, comrade, look at what's happening within Europe in terms of Euroscepticism, in terms of all the issues we're discussing now, you look at the United States, we're as polarized really as we've ever been, I think, in anyone's memory, and everything seems chaotic. It's quite easy to say, look at the West, and you have a United States that no longer wants to lead the world, that no longer values its allies. In other words, the entire system that's existed at least since the end of World War II. It's not that hard to say, there's some problems in the West. But it's a huge leap from saying that to saying, they're in inevitable decline, and now this is the rise of the rest. It's Russia, it's China, it's India, and sort of, the West has had it. So, but from the point of view of a Russian leader like Putin, this is a very useful narrative to have. And you were talking about the traditional values. Putin will say, look at the chaos in the West. We have stability here in Russia. Again, globally we support leaders who are in power, irrespective of how they came into power. And therefore, it's a useful narrative. But underlying it is a reality that obviously the solid West, and the solid democracies and the solid commitment to a rule of law that we thought we had is being questioned, and particularly in this country. 3 years ago, we, after the election, we said, well, we have checks and balances, we have institutions in this country, and this can rein in the executive. Well, it's turning out that that's not, it's easy to say, but we see unraveling before our very eyes this kind of system that we've had for a couple of centuries. So in that sense, and again, it's convenient for the Russian leadership to sort of use this. I wanted to say one other word, though, that had to do with your question as well about the EU and the institutions and the populism. I remember going to Poland in the early 90s and attending a conference there, and the discussion was a very heated discussion among Poles. Do we really want to join the European Union? We've just become a sovereign state, having been under Soviet domination. Do we really want to give up the sovereignty? And I think after 1989 in Central Europe, you obviously, and this comes back to the question of the role of national self-determination, you had all of these countries who were simultaneously trying to reestablish themselves as independent sovereign countries, but also obviously wanting to join Western institutions. So that tension's always been there. And now, of course, what you see in a country like Hungary, particularly in some of the other countries, is now that they're, safely in the European Union, they can complain all they like about European Union institutions telling them that they're eroding the independence of the judiciary. But I think those tensions have never been resolved. And again, it's just 30 years.
Now, Jill, you are also working on a book on Putin.
And she was at the Valdai conference,
and I was at Valdai,
she was at that conference too. And you said you just got back from Russia.
Yeah, the same. I was on the same trip.
Okay.
We sat next to each other, watching Mr. Putin in person. Yes.
In the front row.
In the front row.
Directly in front of him.
Oh, dear. There's so many ways that I could go on this. I just wanted to pick up on something that the ambassador mentioned, the word dignity. I do think that is one of the key things here. And I see it on so many levels. I see it on a national level, I see it on a global level, and I see it on an individual level. And I see it, I've seen it literally among 17-year-olds in Moscow protesting against the government. And I don't know how to define it. I saw it in the Arab Spring, completely different circumstance. But I do think that there is something that, like in the Soviet Union, people ultimately felt that they had lost their dignity on some level, their individual dignity, and they established it in intimate relations with other people whom they trusted, and they felt that they had some dignity that way, at least as a human being. And I hate to be too, squishy emotional, but I do think that this idea of dignity is very, very important. That somehow, each individual country will have to define it, and each person will have to define it. But if people feel that their dignity has been diminished and that they have been insulted, it is going to lead to a lot of very bad things. And if people do feel that whatever we call it, I'd try to get away from liberal democracy. I think I'd invent another term. But if people do feel that their dignity is worth fighting for, they will fight for it eventually in one way or the other. And we in the West can't do that for them. I think we can help in certain ways, but I really think it has to be indigenous. And so it just gets back to individuals in each country. And for so long in this part of the world, individuals did not have any rights protected, or they were pushed down and prevented from taking part in civil society or whatever. So that growth of civil society and the ability to let's say, defend your dignity as a human being, to me is the only way that anything is going to change.
Well, I can't agree more with what Jill has said. The word dignity was mentioned by Martin, I think, when he argued about Slovakia. But I'm adding another word into this concept, and that's civility. Yeah. Because I think in recent years, in my country and in other countries that I'm following, the language and the way politicians are communicating, that became really rough. And then we cannot be surprised when people, tend to respond in a similar way, but they don't respond by supporting Democrats, they're responding by supporting extremists, because the difference, I think, between Democrats and populism and the rest is the Democrats, they must have red lines, which they never cross. But, you cannot compete with populists because populists have no red lines. And then we are losing this battle. And point number 2 that I wanted to make is, of course, there is a reason to be concerned, and we have to be vigilant when it comes to democracy and rule of law in our countries and so on and so on. And I don't want to excuse what's happening. But if you look back at those 30 years, because we're discussing that, and no doubt that there is this huge success that we have witnessed, because we are better off. I mean, Slovakia started with 35% of GDP as compared to average of European Union. We have now 80%. We are wealthier. We are better off. But if you look at those 30 years, that's the point that I wanted to make. I would divide it into two parts. The first 15 years were about, transforming the society. And we cannot oversee or overlook the huge social costs of that transformation. I mean, what our people had to go through, it's unprecedented. The next 15 years were about a constant crisis management, and one crisis was chasing another crisis. In the moment, since we entered the European Union, we have not experienced European Union as something that was portrayed as an anchor of stability. On the contrary, from the point when we entered, it all started with financial crisis, when euro almost fell apart. Then when we stabilized in a way, we were all of a sudden confronted with the territorial aggression, which we thought can never happen after 1990.
From Russia into
Ukraine, Crimea. And thirdly, when we did something in order to stabilize euro and save eurozone and everything, economy, and then the growth came back, and Russia somehow, the West was united still with sanctions and everything, migration came. So in fact, those 30 years, you can divide it also into these two periods. One, the transformation and a huge cost, and number two, a constant crisis management. I've been in the European Union for 6 years, but it was one crisis after another. So the picture that people in those 30 years have received was not that rosy at the end of the day.
So in the last 2 minutes we have left, a lightning round to consider the points that you've just brought up. To bring it back full circle to 1989, was there too much hubris in the assumption that democracy was the way to go? Bringing up the question that our student from the Georgetown Foreign Service School asked, are there some cultures where democracy is antithetical? And did we just overlook that and apply what was working for us because we were the victors? And if there was something that was done wrong then that has led to this bruised dignity to this day, how do you fix that? And that will give, of course, Alina a chance to talk about her report.
Well, I'll just say one thing. I think to go back to this question of whose fight is it and who lost whom, this is like a constant debate that we have in the Russia world, who lost Russia, right? I think the reality is that, and this is the main takeaway from this report you mentioned, was very long, but the main takeaway is that it has to be the civil society, the people on the ground, that take control of their own fate and they fight for those values. And that is the big lesson in 1989. To me, these things didn't come out of the blue. There were movements, social movements that led to eventual fall of the Soviet Union, among other factors, right? And led to the self-determination that we saw in these places. And it should not be up to us, meaning Westerners, as Jill said, to decide what happens in Russia. It should be up to Russians to decide what happens in Russia. And I do not believe in this cultural determinism, right? That there are some places that, they're just too backwards to have democracy. Because not long ago, that was the narrative around Central Eastern Europe, actually, that if we go back to the 1990s, the big fear was that the Soviet Union falls apart. These former Soviet states were going to regress into some sort of tribalism and feudalism. And of course, that was the complete opposite of what happened. These places became the beacons of democracy, right? And so the idea that there are some people, some countries that somehow cannot sustain democracy, I think is completely false. Well, but it's not something you get and then you keep.
Well, but you automatically assumed that they'd be backward. I think our student colleague, by chance, might you be from the Asian region? Where places like China, they say, we don't want democracy, we want communism, that suits our culture. So.
Again, I think that's not what I didn't mean to say they were bad. That was the narrative that you saw around the time. That was the big fear that some places cannot sustain democracy. But I think the point I'm making is that these are actually, if we dig, again, beyond democracy into what that means on a day-to-day basis, I actually think there are universal values there that most people, if you start to ask in these surveys anyways, what do you want in your life? What do you want for your children? Actually, that sounds like a democratic society without them saying that's what it is. But again, it's a process. And I think just to wrap up what I was going to say, I think what we haven't also touched on, and this is what I'm concerned with, is that as we move on away from these key moments like 1989, we don't have a generation that has experienced what that took, and they take it for granted. Right? They take for granted that they live in these open societies where you have access to all of these different things, whether it be economic prosperity, whether that be freedom of speech and expression. But it was blood, sweat, and tears that led to those democratic transformations. And I think this is what's being lost right now. And that is my concern, that we need to keep up that spirit of these critical moments for that reason.
A couple brief last thoughts?
Sure. I think it's authoritarian leaders like Putin and Xi Jinping who tell their own population, democracy doesn't suit you. It's chaotic. We have collectivist societies. Individualism and materialism are bad. And there are many other authoritarian leaders. That's what they tell their populations. I agree completely with Alina. People, if given the choice, they want freedom. Whether they understand exactly how you operate in a more advanced democracy, that's more challenging and it takes longer. But I think the idea that there are some, national characters that aren't suited to this, that's what the rulers tell you when they don't want you to have it. And in response to your question about hubris, no. I mean, we in the West saw what the people in East Germany and in Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Poland, etc., what they wanted. And so we were following them. They wanted democracy. They wanted freedom.
Thank you. Ambassador Jill, last thoughts?
I would just leave it like that. I absolutely agree with this. I mean, I saw people on the streets in Moscow looking at Boris Yeltsin early on, and they were not faking it. They believed that something was going to change. They couldn't define it because they'd never had anything like that. But they really did believe in freedom. And I think that's still there. So I'll just leave it at that.
I agree with everything. I have another point that if you give me 1 or 2 minutes. Well, we haven't talked about it, but if you look at what politics looks like, then I dare say that in recent 10 to 20 years, and that's not a phenomenon just for Central Europe, but at large for Western democracies, politics is driven these days much more, I think, by sophisticated opinion polls and focus groups than it is driven by the ideas and by what politicians know should be done for the country, but they don't know how to win elections with that. So I think what we would need at large in Central Europe, in Western democracies, is more of a democratic political leadership where, once again, politicians would have a courage and they would dare do what is good for the country. And not only, Germans know it, nach dem Munde reden. So basically do what people want politicians to do, because much more needs to be done.
So let us leave this on a positive note that on this anniversary, we are looking at both a challenge to what came out of 1989, but also an opportunity for a new generation, for them to put in the blood, sweat, and tears to win the cause of democracy all over again. Thank you very much. And